which have been brought to you. And I'll give you right now the floor. Mr. Head of Delegation, you do have the floor. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, members, distinguished members of the committee. It is our intention, certainly, Mr. Chairman, to answer all the questions that has been brought to us, and this is exactly why we stayed up late at night yesterday. So I will attempt to answer some of the questions and the comments that have been made yesterday before giving the floor to my colleagues in the delegation to expand on specific topics relevant to their specialized work. In this regard, I would like to start by reaffirming the State of Palestine's appreciation to all the constructive input and to restate our readiness and eagerness to work with all members of the committees as well as partners and friends worldwide to fulfill Palestine's objective of full compliance with the CERD. For the sake of clarity and giving some of the comments made yesterday, I feel it is necessary to restate some fundamental truths that remind us all of the legal context and the reality which we are discussing. The situation in the State of Palestine is one of prolonged, belligerent military occupation by a foreign power, and this also answers to the question of the issue of the areas that Palestine control. The State of Palestine as a whole is under occupation. We do have limited control over certain areas within the city centers, but that limited control is also challenged. We have no control over our borders, we have no control over our natural resources, we have no control over connecting cities together. All this can be brought to a full halt by occupation, including the little control that we have in city centers. Now, that does not mean at all that Palestine does not intend to move forward and will not allow for these actions and the presence of occupation to hold back a whole nation from progression and moving forward and exercising its right to self-determination, including through our presence here, through signing treaties, through adopting laws, and trying to move forward as much as possible. It is important to point out that the relationship discussed between Israel, the illegal occupant of the State of Palestine, and Palestinian people is one between occupier and occupied. This is not a matter of varying options or perspectives, and certain distinguished members have raised this point that we're vying over the narrative and we're vying over the importance of who is on the right side. But the reality is not that. The reality is that there is an occupier and there are occupied people. There is an oppressor and there are oppressed people. There are people who are living under occupation for a prolonged period of time. And by the way, for those who don't know, this is also a legal fact, which was also confirmed by the International Court of Justice, the Security Council, the General Assembly. In fact, each and every respectful and reputable international body has recognized this fact. So this legal fact, and it is governed also by the rules of international law. So everything that has led to the world adopting also the convention that we are discussing today is in confirmation that the situation of Palestine is that the one I have just described, including, of course, as it relates to the high contracting parties, as it relates to the international humanitarian law, and as it relates to several other international laws. So it is important to state that advancing any false pretext of moral equivalence here is neither accurate nor conducive to a constructive dialogue. It is also detached from reality and divorced from human nature, which naturally rejects injustice, discrimination, racism, and oppression. On one hand, you have an occupying power that exercises absolute control over the lives, rights, livelihoods, and resources of an entire nation. On the other, you have a nation that is denied its fundamental individual and collective rights across the board, including the right to self-determination, which your committee also have general recommendations on. What was it, 28, 25? General? Almost. Okay, let's not quote the number. So the Palestinian citizens' natural right to life, resources, are all subject to a myriad of punitive and discriminatory policies and practices imposed by Israeli occupation and targeted exclusively against Palestinians because of their nationality. Further, the Palestinian citizens' fundamental right to access health care, safe and sufficient drinking water, electricity, municipal services, technology. I don't know what they fear of technology, but even technologies is also included, and other basic services and requirements of life are subject to the whims and policies of Israeli occupation regime. This racist regime of oppression and discrimination grants itself the right to decide on the calorie consumption of Palestinian population, as we see in Gaza. They determine how much calories each Gazan can consume every day. Treats allowing Palestinians limited access to these basics as a gift deserving appreciation and praise. So it is symptomatic, similar to all colonial regimes that that people and nations suffered from. It's no different from those. It is important to point out that your esteemed committee drafted also general recommendations to provide guidance on the requirements of the Convention in the area of racist hate speech in order to assist states parties in discharging their obligations, including reporting obligations. In paragraph 14 of the said recommendation, and I quote, the committee recommends that public denials or attempts to justify crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity as defined by international law should be declared as offenses punishable by law, provided that they clearly constitute incitement of racial violence and hatred. The committee also underlines that the expression of opinions about historical facts should not be prohibited or punished. I need to also refer to paragraph 15 of those recommendations, in which the Committee on the Qualification of Dissemination and Incitement as Offences Punishable by Law, the Committee considers certain contextual factors should be taken. So it's not an open-ended criteria. First, the economic, social, and political climate prevalent at the time the speech was made. Second, the objective of the speech protecting or defending the human rights of individuals and groups should not be subject to criminal or other sanctions. So in this regard, and the context that I have just described, and the reality, dissent and protest against such injustices is the natural response. It is the moral response. It is only expected outcome from a nation yearning to live in freedom and dignity. To treat this dissent and protest as amounting to incitement is in itself racist, because it tacitly assumes that Palestinians are not the quality of humans in nature or rights, that Palestinians do not have the fundamental right to enjoy the basic rights that all peoples are entitled to, as enshrined in international humanitarian and human rights law, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the CERD. The unbearable condition under which our people live, specifically prolonged and cruel foreign military domination and oppression, are the main source of violence and create an environment conducive to violence and perpetual conflict. Accepting oppression and coexistence with daily humiliation is simply against human nature. Palestinians are not an exception to this universal rule. Talking about Palestinian history and reality is not incitement. The Palestinian people cannot be asked to reject their own history and narrative and accept in a counterintuitive and humiliating manner the endorsement of their occupiers' racist narrative and self-serving classifications of the Palestinians. Having stated the obvious, I must remind that the state of Palestine, and despite this crushing and unjust reality, has taken all measures possible to ensure that Palestinian society's soul and character, and this answers to your questions about incitement, because it was prevalent yesterday in the questions of the committee, of the distinguished committee. We are working to preserve the soul and character and ensure that it is not tarnished by this daily and systematic violence. Our efforts to combat incitement and hate speech stem from our commitment to our collective identity and culture. We are determined not to allow the cruelty of occupation to strip us from our humanity or turn us into a nation driven by anger and hate. The Palestinian people are motivated and driven by their commitment to life and prosperity, by their absolute and the faith in their right to live in freedom, dignity, and prosperity. Our accession to international law instruments, including this convention, come in this context, as do our efforts to harmonize our laws with these instruments. At the same time, given the context I have just outlined, it is important to point out that in our discussion and assessment, the only acceptable measure against actions and practices against violations of international law, including international humanitarian law, it is only acceptable that we bring about our concerns to committees like yours. As far as Israeli actions and policies are concerned, we remind that in addition to being state party to CERD, Israel, the illegal occupant of the State of Palestine, is bound by the obligations set out in the Fourth Geneva Convention. Its illegal actions of collective punishment and oppression, like, for example, home demolitions, which was brought yesterday as a disciplinary measure that Israel applies, can only be examined in the view of its obligation as a state party as well as an occupying power. Briefly on the issue of home demolitions, Israel employs this illegal policy in two ways. On the one hand, it used this cruel measure as a tool of collective punishment against the families of Palestinian citizens it accuses of carrying out attacks, notwithstanding the fact that Israeli military corps are employed as tool of oppression or the fact that the Israeli courts and judges are complicit in legitimizing this illegal measure. In this regard, the State of Palestine's position on Israeli acts of home demolition is very clear and in line with international law, that these demolitions are illegal and constitute collective punishment. As such, and regardless of the pretext occupation authorities use to justify these demolitions, the State of Palestine exercises its duty towards its citizens by this illegal policy and taking measures to provide the needed care to forcibly displaced families. That is our duty towards our citizens who have the rightful expectation to enjoy their right to housing, ownership, and property. Several of the distinguished committee members also asked about the issue of anti-Semitism, and in fact, a whole intervention was based on that issue. I believe, yeah, it was. All right. On this issue, and moving on to this weaponized accusation of anti-Semitism, we have to stress certain issues. First, that there are groups of individuals that are attempting to force a perverse definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates legitimate criticism of Israel and its occupation with anti-Semitism. This definition is highly problematic and counterproductive. It has also been rejected by a wide range of distinguished Jewish, Israeli, and international human rights organizations. As a point of principle, the State of Palestine, and this is important, rejects and combats all forms of hate and racism, including anti-Semitism. However, like many Jewish and even Israeli organizations, Palestine does not accept Israel's claim that it represents all Jews across the world. We consider this claim to be an inverted form of anti-Semitism, and we do not believe that Jews around the world, or even Israeli, can be held responsible for the grave violations against Palestinian peoples committed by Israeli occupation. This weaponized claim of anti-Semitism is cynical and counterproductive. It does a great disservice to combating real anti-Semitism and to advancing and protecting Palestinian human rights. Simply put, it is a ruse devised to silence righteous dissent, and it must be unequivocally rejected. Supporting Palestinian human rights and criticizing Israeli violations are rooted in international law and universal values of human rights. In the words of Not Now organization, an inspiring Jewish American organization, the Israeli occupation, and I quote, "The Israeli occupation is a daily nightmare for those who live under it and a moral disaster for those who support and administer it," end quote. As such, advocating for Palestinian rights and criticizing Israeli violations is not anti-Semitic. Rather, it is an expression of moral consistency and a rejection of racist notions of exceptionalism that attempt to justify oppression of any people or group while granting others a cover for violating human rights. Allow me to turn more into other questions that have been discussed yesterday in relation to activation of Article 14. It is important to point out that I have stated twice in my statement that we have already deposited our accession, our declaration recognizing the article. So once again, I restate that Palestine is now has activated Article 14, and we have the national NGO, the Independent Commission for Human Rights, will be overlooking the complaints served to the committee or other direct complaints. Will follow up on these complaints. In